three cases. Three moments in history where ordinary lives suddenly became part of the criminal record. Tonight, we revisit the disturbing case of Ivy Mitchell, the mysterious death of Maj Kirby, and the horrifying case of William Starchfield, stories that shocked their communities and still linger in historical archives today. Ivy Mitchell. Investigators examined the area described in the statement and compared it to the physical evidence already preserved. Hoofprints were located near the scene where Ivy had been found, as well as in the vicinity of a nearby water tank. These prints were documented and measured, then considered alongside the footprints that had been protected at the site of the discovery. The alignment of the tracks suggested movement through the same ground described by the witness. The distance between the road, the school grounds, and the point where Ivy was found could be traced without interruption. Each location fit within a single continuous path across the terrain. At this stage, the investigation remained cautious. No conclusions were drawn and no assumptions were recorded. However, the combination of independent observation and physical evidence began to reduce the field of possibility. The ground itself, marked by hooves and footsteps, was no longer neutral. It had started to indicate direction, and with it, the presence of someone who had passed through at precisely the wrong moment. As investigators continued to follow the trail indicated by witness accounts and physical evidence, attention narrowed to a single individual known to have been riding in the area that afternoon. He was employed as a farm laborer and had been seen moving along routes that intersected with the path Ivy Mitchell was expected to take. Police inquiries established that the man had been on horseback during the relevant hours. His movements placed him near the school grounds, and later within reach of the scrubland where Ivy was found. These facts were recorded without inference, forming a timeline based solely on location and opportunity. During the course of the investigation, a boot sole and heel were recovered. When examined, the tread pattern was compared against the footprints preserved at the scene. The match was described as consistent in size and form, sufficient to warrant further attention. Plaster casts and measurements were taken to document the comparison. A second witness then provided additional information. This individual reported observing the same farm laborer at work shortly after Ivy's disappearance, seated and engaged in an unusual task. Using a knife, he appeared to be scraping or cutting at the sole of his boot. He later asked for pincers, which were provided, and was seen removing part of the footwear. No explanation was offered at the time for this behavior. Investigators recorded the account and examined the boots in question. The alterations described by the witness corresponded with the missing sole and heel already recovered. When set alongside the preserved footprints, the sequence of events required no speculation to understand its significance. By this stage, the evidence no longer existed as separate observations. The tracks in the ground, the recovered boot components, and the witness accounts all converged. What had once been scattered across roads and fields was now tied to a single person, whose movements and actions had become central to the investigation. The case against the accused was brought before the court in due course, transferring the matter from investigation to formal adjudication. He was charged with the murder of Ivy Mitchell and, when called upon to answer, entered a plea of not guilty. From that point, the proceedings followed the order required by law. The prosecution presented its case through a sequence of witnesses and exhibits. Evidence collected at the scene was introduced, including the preserved footprints and the boot sole and heel recovered during the investigation. Testimony described how these items had been located, protected, and examined, and how their patterns corresponded. Witnesses who had observed a mounted man near the school grounds on the afternoon of Ivy's disappearance gave their accounts, placing him in the area at the relevant time. In the early years of the 20th century, the district of Samford, Queensland, was a small and orderly place. Its days were shaped by distance, daylight, and routine, and most families were known to one another by name, habit, and history. It was here that Ivy Mitchell spent the later part of her short life. Ivy Mitchell was born on the 10th of January 1902 in Grafton, New South Wales, the fifth of 6 children in her family. Her mother was of Danish origin, and for several years the Mitchell family remained in New South Wales before relocating north to Queensland. By the time Ivy reached adolescence, the family had settled near Samford, where her father worked, and the children attended church and school within walking distance of home. In 1912, Ivy's mother died. The loss altered the household in practical ways, rather than visible ones. Within a short time, her father remarried, and the family structure adjusted around the new arrangement. Ivy remained at home, helping where she was needed and continuing her daily routines without incident or remark. There is no record of conflict, unrest, or unusual behavior attributed to her during these years. Those who knew Ivy described her as quiet, obedient, and dependable. She was known to follow instructions carefully, to keep to familiar paths, and to return home when expected. Her movements were predictable, her habits consistent. In a community where deviation was noticed quickly, Ivy attracted no special attention at all. Her days were marked by fixed times, known distances, and familiar roads, patterns that repeated themselves with little variation, and which, until one afternoon, had never failed. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. This story begins in an ordinary village, much like countless theirs. On the afternoon Ivy Mitchell disappeared, nothing about the day initially set it apart from any other. It followed the same pattern she had observed many times before, governed by time, familiarity, and expectation rather than chance. Earlier that day, Ivy attended church, as she routinely did. Services concluded without incident, and afterward she went to visit a friend who lived some distance from her family's home. The visit was ordinary and uneventful. Ivy stayed for several hours, passing the afternoon in company that was familiar to her and within a setting she had visited before. As the day wore on, Ivy became aware of the time. Those who later accounted for her movements noted that she was cautious about traveling after dark. The road between her friend's home and the Mitchell residence was known to her, but it was long, sparsely settled in places, and poorly lit once daylight faded. Ivy was not in the habit of lingering late, and on this afternoon she prepared to leave while there was still sufficient light. She departed at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon. The route she was expected to take led her along a familiar road, past open land and stretches of scrub, before turning toward home. The distance was one she had covered many times, on foot and without accompaniment. There was no indication that she anticipated delay or difficulty. When Ivy left her friend's house, she did so as she always had, walking alone at a steady pace along a road she knew well. It was a journey measured not in uncertainty, but in habit, one that, until that evening, had always ended the same way. By the time darkness settled over Samford, Ivy Mitchell had not returned home. At first, her absence did not immediately signal alarm. Delays were uncommon but not impossible, and the family waited for her arrival as they had on other evenings. Attention was given first to the position of the body, then to the ground nearby. Footprints were visible in the soil, distinct enough to show their outline and direction. To prevent accidental damage, boxes were placed over the impressions, and small twigs were set into the earth to mark the line they formed. Officers were posted around the area to ensure that nothing was disturbed while the scene was documented. The body was removed only after these measures were completed. It was taken from the site under supervision and transported for examination. The location itself remained secured, with officers maintaining watch through the night. By this point, the search that had begun as a family effort had given way entirely to official procedure. The ground where Ivy had been found was no longer treated as part of the surrounding countryside, but as evidence. Each mark, each impression was preserved as it lay, fixed in place while responsibility passed fully from those who had been looking for Ivy to those tasked with determining what had happened to her. Following its removal from the scene, Ivy Mitchell's body was taken to the mortuary for formal examination. The process was conducted under official supervision and recorded in accordance with standard procedure. Responsibility for the examination fell to the government medical officer, whose findings would determine the direction of the investigation from that point forward. The examination established that Ivy's death was the result of deliberate violence. The cause was recorded as injuries inflicted on the throat, sufficient to account for death. In addition to these wounds, marks were noted on her hands and arms, consistent with attempts to resist. These injuries were documented as having occurred prior to death, indicating that Ivy had been conscious and struggling at the time she was attacked. The condition of the body provided no evidence of accidental harm or self-inflicted injury. There were no findings to suggest that the injuries could be attributed to a fall, an animal attack, or any other unintended cause. The pattern and placement of the wounds were recorded as intentional. Based on these observations, the death was formally classified as homicide. The findings were communicated to investigators without delay, replacing uncertainty with a clear determination of criminal responsibility. What had begun as a missing person search was now confirmed as an investigation into a violent crime. With the medical examination complete, the scope of the inquiry narrowed decisively. The question was no longer whether Ivy Mitchell had met with harm, but who had caused it, and under what circumstances. From this point forward, every preserved footprint, every witness statement, and every movement in the hours following her disappearance would be examined against the facts established at the mortuary, facts that left no room for alternative explanation. Following the examination at the mortuary, investigators began collecting statements from those who had been in the area on the evening Ivy Mitchell disappeared. Attention was directed toward anyone who might have been along the roads or nearby land during the late afternoon and early evening hours. One account came from a farm laborer who reported seeing a man on horseback near the school grounds at approximately 5 o'clock that afternoon. The sighting placed the rider in close proximity to the route Ivy was expected to take home, and within the narrow window of time after she had left her friend's house. The witness stated that the rider was moving at speed and appeared to be carrying a long object in his hand, described as resembling a branch or switch. No interaction was observed, and no reason was given at the time to regard the sighting as unusual. As time passed, the expectation that Ivy would appear at the door remained unfulfilled. The evening grew quieter, and the usual sounds of movement along the road outside the house faded. When Ivy still had not returned, attention turned to the hour. It was later than she would ordinarily remain away, particularly given her habit of avoiding travel after nightfall. James Mitchell, Ivy's 16-year-old brother, was the first to act. He took a lantern and went out along the road she was expected to walk, moving a short distance in each direction and calling her name. The road was empty. There was no sign that Ivy had passed through after dark, nor any indication that she had stopped nearby. James then went to the home of the friend Ivy had visited that afternoon. There he confirmed that she had left at approximately 4:30 as planned, and that nothing unusual had occurred during the visit. Ivy had not mentioned changing her route or delaying her return. With that confirmation, the last verified point in Ivy's day was fixed. She had left her friend's house on schedule and had begun the walk home before sunset. Beyond that moment, there were no witnesses, no messages, and no explanation for her absence. What had once been accounted for by habit and routine now ended in uncertainty, with a stretch of road between two known points and no record of what had occurred along it. Once it was clear that Ivy Mitchell had not reached home, her absence was no longer treated as a delay. Her father organized a search without hesitation, gathering his children and calling on nearby neighbors to assist. The effort moved outward from the house and onto the road Ivy was expected to have taken earlier that evening. The search followed the route methodically. Lanterns were carried and attention was kept low to the ground, where signs of passage might still be visible. The road itself showed nothing at first. It was dry, firm underfoot, and marked only by the usual tracks left by carts and livestock. The group moved slowly, scanning both sides of the roadway and calling Ivy's name as they went. Not far from the road, marks began to appear. Footprints were visible in the softer ground near the edge, leading away from the track Ivy would normally have followed. The impressions were clear enough to distinguish direction and movement. Nearby, grass had been pressed down, as though someone had passed through in haste or with weight. The search shifted course. Attention moved off the road and into the surrounding scrub, where visibility was limited and the ground uneven. The lantern light caught more signs of disturbance, flattened vegetation and broken stems, forming a narrow line that continued away from the path. These were not marks meant to guide anyone. They were the incidental traces left behind by movement, noticed only because the search had slowed and the ground was being examined closely. Following them meant leaving the certainty of the road behind and entering terrain where direction was no longer obvious. By then, the search was no longer about waiting for Ivy to appear. It had become an effort to understand where she had gone, guided only by the faintest signs that she had not stayed on the path at all. The search ended in the scrub, some distance from the road Ivy Mitchell was expected to have taken. There, the group found her body, The discovery was made without ceremony and without confusion. Once it was clear what had been found, the search stopped, and word was sent for the police. Authorities were notified immediately, and the area was left undisturbed until officers arrived. By the time police reached the location, night had fully set in. Senior officers assumed control of the site and directed that no further movement occur beyond what were used as necessary. Those who had taken part in the search were instructed to step back, and the surrounding ground was examined under lantern light. Additional testimony addressed the behavior observed after the disappearance, including the alteration of footwear and the recovery of tools used for that purpose. Medical evidence was summarized, confirming the cause of death and the presence of injuries consistent with resistance. Statements attributed to the accused following his arrest were also entered into the record. The defense challenged the prosecution's case on procedural grounds. It was argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the timing of certain findings could not be established with certainty, and that alternative explanations had not been excluded. These arguments were presented without interruption and recorded as part of the proceedings. After closing submissions, the jury retired to consider its verdict. Their deliberations extended into the following day. When they returned to the courtroom, their decision was delivered without commentary. The conclusion had been reached not in the fields or along the road where Ivy had last walked, but within the confines of the court, based solely on what had been placed before them. Following the jury's verdict, a sentence was passed in accordance with the law. The accused was condemned to death, and the date of execution was set. There were no recorded irregularities in the proceedings that followed. The case moved from the court record into the administrative process that governed capital punishment at the time. The execution was carried out as scheduled. In the hours before his death, the condemned man made a confession, acknowledging responsibility for Ivy Mitchell's killing. The statement was taken and entered into the official record. No further explanation or elaboration accompanied it. After the execution, his body was buried in the prison grounds, in keeping with standard practice. The location was marked only by documentation, not by ceremony. With the sentence carried out, the legal case was closed. Ivy Mitchell's name remained in court transcripts, police files and newspaper reports, preserved through the processes that had followed her death. The man convicted of her murder became a footnote of a different kind. His execution was recorded as the last of its kind in Queensland, preceding the abolition of capital punishment in the state in 1922. In the years that followed, the place where Ivy's body had been found became associated with later claims and stories, passed on through local memory rather than official inquiry. These accounts were not part of the legal record and prompted no further investigation. What remained certain was what had been written down at the time: dates, findings, testimony, and judgment. The law had taken its course. When it ended, it left behind a file that did not change, and a place that people continued to remember for reasons that no longer required explanation. Maj Kirby. In 1908, Liverpool stood as one of Britain's busiest port cities, its docks feeding the empire with a constant flow of ships, cargo, and people. The streets nearest the river were dense and restless, lined with tightly packed terraced housing built to serve the city's vast working population. Families lived close together, often sharing walls, courtyards, and narrow alleyways where daily life spilled outdoors. From early morning, the city moved on foot. Dock workers walked toward the waterfront, shopkeepers lifted their shutters, and children navigated the streets with a familiarity learned early. In working-class districts, it was common for children to run errands alone, collecting food, visiting local shops, or delivering messages, tasks shaped by necessity rather than choice. Public streets were extensions of the home, watched casually by neighbors, tradesmen, and passers-by. Yet this constant movement came with quiet risks. Crowded streets did not always mean safe ones, and routine could create a false sense of security. On an ordinary morning in Liverpool, amid carts, voices, and shop fronts opening for business, nothing appeared unusual. The city followed its well-worn rhythms, unaware that one small everyday journey was about to break them. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. This story begins in an ordinary village, much like countless others. Maj Kirby was a young girl living with her family in Liverpool, in a neighborhood shaped by work, routine and close quarters. Her home was one of many modest residences occupied by working-class families who depended on regular wages and shared responsibility to keep daily life functioning. Madge's presence within the household was ordinary and documented. She was known to neighbours, familiar to local shopkeepers, and accustomed to moving through the nearby streets. Only weeks earlier, the family had suffered a significant loss. Madge's mother had died, an event that altered the structure of the home and placed additional strain on those who remained. With fewer adults to divide responsibilities, children were often expected to help where they could, contributing in small but necessary ways. Madge was accustomed to these expectations. She knew the surrounding streets, the nearby shops, and the routine paths taken each day. Nothing about her movements stood out as unusual or reckless. They reflected the normal patterns of children in her community. On the day she disappeared, Madge left her home on a simple errand, one she had likely completed many times before. Maj Kirby was last seen on a weekday in 1908, during the late morning hours, when the streets of her neighbourhood were already active with shoppers, workers and children moving freely between homes and local businesses. She had set out on a routine errand and was accompanied briefly by another child from the area, a normal occurrence in a district where children often walk together for short distances. At some point along the route, the two encountered an adult man. Witness accounts later confirmed that he addressed Madge directly, offering her a small treat and encouraging her to come with him. The other child hesitated and refused, choosing to turn back. Madge did not. That moment marked the final confirmed decision point. In full view of the street, without force or visible struggle, Madge walked away alongside the man. No alarm was raised at the time, and nothing about the encounter appeared immediately threatening to those nearby. It was the last moment Maj Kirby was seen by anyone who knew her. When Maj Kirby failed to return home, concern grew quickly within her family. Her absence was not easily dismissed. The errand she had been sent on required little time, and she was known to follow familiar routes. As minutes passed without any sign of her, those at home began asking neighbours if she had been seen. No one could provide an answer. The child who had been with Madge earlier was soon located and questioned. It was then that the encounter with the unknown man was reported. With that information, the situation shifted from uncertainty to alarm. Madge's family contacted the police, providing her name, age, and a description of her clothing, along with the last known details of where she had been seen. Officers began making immediate inquiries in the surrounding streets, speaking with shopkeepers and residents. Word of the disappearance spread rapidly through the neighbourhood. By the end of the day, Maj Kirby's absence was no longer a private worry. It had entered official police record as a missing child case. As police began retracing Maj Kirby's likely route, several witnesses came forward with accounts that placed her in different locations after she left home. Each sighting confirmed that she had continued moving through the city with the same adult man. One of the earliest witnesses was a local shopkeeper who noticed Madge holding the man's hand as they passed by. The interaction stood out because Madge appeared distressed. She was crying, while the man showed no visible urgency or agitation. The shopkeeper later stated that the contrast between the child's behavior and the man's calm demeanor prompted concern, enough that the witness attempted to follow them for a short distance before losing sight of them in the crowded streets. Another confirmed encounter occurred at a small food shop, where the pair stopped briefly. Madge was still upset, but the man spoke for her, purchasing a drink and food. The transaction was unremarkable at the time, yet later became significant because it placed Madge further along her route and confirmed the man's continued control over the situation. A final sighting came from a boy running errands nearby, who recalled seeing Madge walking with the same man toward another part of the neighbourhood. After that moment, the trail ended. Despite multiple witnesses and a clear path of movement, no one intervened, and Maj Kirby vanished into the city. Following the confirmed witness accounts, police initiated a coordinated search across the surrounding districts. Officers conducted systematic house-to-house inquiries along the streets where Maj Kirby had last been seen, questioning residents, tenants and shopkeepers about any unusual activity. Vacant buildings, yards and alleyways were examined, with particular attention paid to properties that allowed temporary concealment. Tracking dogs were brought in to follow Madge's known route. They traced her movements through several streets before losing the scent, a result investigators attributed to heavy foot traffic, and the constant movement typical of the area. Despite this limitation, the effort helped narrow the timeline and confirm the direction in which she had been taken. Authorities also extended their search beyond private residences. Nearby institutions, including lodging houses and religious homes, were contacted to determine whether a child matching Madge's description had been brought in. Ports and transport points were checked, and police made inquiries beyond the immediate neighborhood in case she had been moved quickly. Madge's description and clothing were circulated publicly, appearing in notices and press reports in an effort to prompt further sightings. Despite these measures, no new confirmed information emerged. Years passed without recovery or arrest, and the active trail began to fade. As days turned into weeks, the urgency that had once surrounded Maj Kirby's disappearance began to thin. Police continued to receive occasional tips, but none produced credible new sightings or evidence. Streets that had been searched repeatedly returned to their usual rhythms, and public attention shifted toward other concerns. The case remained open, but without momentum. For Madge's family, the waiting did not ease. Each day passed without answers, marked only by uncertainty and the absence left behind. No confirmation arrived to explain where she had been taken or what had happened after she vanished from view. The investigation lingered in a state of suspension, neither concluded nor advancing. By this stage, Maj Kirby was no longer the subject of daily searches or fresh leads. She had become part of an unresolved record, defined by what was missing rather than what was known. Then, weeks later, the quiet was broken by an unexpected discovery. Several weeks after Maj Kirby's disappearance, the case took a sudden and decisive turn. Near the Dock Road area, a worker moving through a relatively quiet stretch of ground noticed a large sack lying close to a set of steps. Its placement appeared deliberate rather than discarded, prompting the man to alert authorities instead of disturbing it. Police arrived and examined the sack at the scene before arranging for its removal. When it was opened, it was found to contain human remains. The condition of the body indicated that death had occurred some time earlier, consistent with the period since Madge had vanished. Due to decomposition, immediate visual identification was not possible, and the remains were handled with caution. The sack and its contents were transferred to the mortuary for formal examination. Officers secured the area and began documenting the location, noting its proximity to routes that had already been searched during the initial investigation. The discovery raised immediate questions about how the body had gone unnoticed for weeks, despite earlier efforts. Although no official identification had yet been made, investigators recognized the likelihood that the remains belonged to the missing child. The case shifted from a disappearance to a suspected homicide, pending confirmation. At the mortuary, efforts were made to establish the identity of the remains recovered near the Dock Road. Due to the condition of the body, visual identification was not possible. Instead, investigators relied on clothing and personal items found with the remains. These articles were carefully documented and compared with the description provided when Maj Kirby was first reported missing. Madge's father was asked to attend and view the clothing. He confirmed that the garments matched those his daughter had been wearing on the day she left home. This identification, though indirect, was considered sufficient under the circumstances and was formally recorded by authorities. No conflicting claims or alternative missing person reports emerged to challenge the conclusion. With this confirmation, the case was officially reclassified. Maj Kirby was no longer listed as missing. Her disappearance was now recognized as a fatal crime. While the method and exact circumstances of her death remained unclear, the investigation entered a new phase, focused not on locating her, but on determining who was responsible and how the crime had been carried out. The discovery of Maj Kirby's remains raised immediate questions about the earlier search efforts. Newspapers and members of the public began to scrutinize how the body could have remained undiscovered for weeks, particularly given its location near areas that had already been examined. The proximity of the site to established routes and accessibilities. The ground intensified this concern. Reports noted that the Dock Road area was not remote, nor entirely hidden from view. This led to criticism that despite extensive inquiries and repeated searches, a critical location had been overlooked. Authorities acknowledged the difficulty of searching densely used urban spaces, where movement and routine activity could conceal evidence over time, but the explanations did little to quiet public unease. No formal findings of negligence were made, yet the questions lingered. How long had the body been there? Had it been placed at the site later, or missed during initial searches? These uncertainties shifted attention away from whether Madge would be found and toward how the crime had been carried out. The focus of the investigation turned from recovery to reconstruction, as officers sought to understand the sequence of events that followed her disappearance. As investigators examined the circumstances surrounding Maj Kirby's death, attention turned to physical locations that could explain how the crime had been carried out without immediate detection. One such site was an abandoned property, not far from where her remains were discovered. The building had been unoccupied for some time and showed signs of unauthorized entry. Inside, officers observed handprints left in layers of settled dust, suggesting recent movement through the space. There were also indications that entry had been forced, consistent with someone gaining access without keys or permission. While no definitive evidence placed Madge inside the property, the condition of the building raised the possibility that it had been used temporarily. Additional reports supported this line of inquiry. Several witnesses recalled seeing a man carrying large sacks through nearby streets around the time of Madge's disappearance. At the time, these sightings had not drawn attention, but in light of the discovery Nassim Eardock Road, they were reconsidered as potentially relevant. Based on these observations, investigators developed a reasoned theory that Madge may have been taken to a temporary location shortly after her abduction and concealed there before her body was later moved. While no single piece of evidence confirmed this sequence, the physical clues suggested deliberate concealment rather than immediate disposal. Not long after the discovery of Maj Kirby's remains, authorities received a series of letters from an unidentified writer who claimed responsibility for the crime. The correspondence was sent directly to officials and referenced the case in deliberate detail, immediately drawing attention due to its timing and content. In the letters, the writer described actions allegedly taken on the day of Madge's disappearance, including movements through the city and methods used to avoid detection. Certain elements appeared specific, referencing locations and circumstances that were not widely discussed at the time. These details raised the possibility that the author possessed knowledge beyond what had been reported publicly. Despite this, investigators approached the letters with caution. No identifying information accompanied them, and the claims could not be independently verified. Officials were aware that high-profile cases often attracted hoaxes, particularly once details entered the press. Each statement was examined against known facts, but no conclusive link between the writer and the crime could be established. Authorities stopped short of treating the letters as a confession. They were preserved as part of the case record, acknowledged but unproven. Rather than bringing clarity, the correspondence introduced another layer of uncertainty. The letters suggested intent and awareness, yet provided no actionable leads, leaving the investigation unsettled and unresolved. A coroner's inquest was convened to formally examine the circumstances surrounding Maj Kirby's death. The proceedings brought together the available evidence gathered since her disappearance and subsequent discovery, with the aim of establishing what could be confirmed and what could not. Testimony was presented regarding the recovery of the remains, the condition in which they were found, and the method of identification through clothing. Witness accounts tracing Madge's movements on the day she vanished were reviewed, along with details of the search efforts undertaken by police. The letters received by authorities were also addressed during the inquest. Their contents were acknowledged, but officials emphasized that no proof existed to verify the writer's identity or claims. As such, the correspondence was treated cautiously and did not alter the established facts of the case. After considering the evidence, the jury delivered its conclusion. Maj Kirby's death was ruled the result of a deliberate act carried out by a person or persons unknown. No individual was named, and no further legal action followed. With that determination, the inquest closed, providing an official record of the findings, but no resolution as to who was responsible. Maj Kirby's funeral drew a large gathering from the surrounding community, reflecting the impact her death had made beyond her immediate family. Neighbors, residents, and those who had followed the case attended, marking a public moment of recognition for a child whose life had ended violently and without explanation. The service closed the formal search, but it did not bring relief. For the Kirby family, the loss compounded an already fragile situation. The death of Madge's mother earlier that year had left the household under strain, and the events that followed deepened that burden. Daily life continued, but under the ways. 8 of grief and unresolved questions. In the years after Madge's death, her father's health declined. Contemporary records note that he died sometime later, his passing attributed to illness rather than sudden cause. Those close to the family believed the strain of events had taken a lasting toll. With his death, the immediate witnesses to Madge's life and disappearance diminished further, leaving the case increasingly confined to official records rather than living memory. No arrest was ever made in the death of Maj Kirby. No suspect was formally identified, and no conviction followed. After the inquest concluded, the investigation receded into the background, its unresolved status fixed in official files rather than active pursuit. What remained were documents, police notes, witness statements, inquest records, and press reports that preserved the known facts without offering answers. These records confirm certain points with clarity. Maj Kirby left her home on a routine errand. She was seen in the company of an unknown man. Weeks later, her remains were recovered. Beyond that, the narrative fractures. The identity of the man, the precise sequence of events after her disappearance, and the authenticity of the letters received by authorities were never resolved. The case endures not because of what it explains, but because of what it does not. It reflects the limitations of early 20th century urban investigations and the vulnerability of ordinary lives within them. Maj Kirby's name survives in archives as a completed file, one marked closed, yet unanswered. The record ends. The question does not. William Starchfield. The winter of 1913 settled heavily over London. Snow had fallen steadily in the final days of December, covering streets, rooftops, and railway lines in a thick, unmoving layer. The cold did not lift with the new year. For more than a week, temperatures remained low enough to harden the snow into ice, disrupting transport, closing businesses early, and slowing the routines of working-class neighbourhoods across the city. On Hampstead Road, life continued with restraint rather than comfort. The buildings were narrow and closely packed, their occupants accustomed to hardship, but unprepared for prolonged cold. Coal fires burned where they could, and errands were done quickly, timed between snowfall and fading daylight. It was here that William Starchfield lived with his mother, Agnes. William was a young child, described in newspaper reports as fair-haired, with long curls that made him easily recognizable in the neighborhood. At 5 years old, he was already trusted with small errands, the sort expected of children in working families at the time. The weather altered even these modest routines. Streets were quieter, journeys took longer, small tasks carried greater risk. Yet on the morning of Thursday, 8th of January 1914, nothing about the day suggested it would be remembered at all. It began like any other winter weekday in North London. Cold, constrained, and ordinary. On the morning of Thursday, 8th of January 1914, the weather had not improved. Snow still lined the pavements along Hampstead Road, and the cold lingered in the air. Inside the Starchfield home, the day followed a familiar pattern shaped by necessity rather than comfort. Agnes Starchfield entrusted her son, William, with a small errand, giving him a single penny and instructions to make 2 short stops nearby. William was first sent to a local baker, a routine task he had carried out before. From there, he was to visit a stationer located at 147 Hampstead Road. Both locations were within walking distance, along streets he knew well. According to later statements, William was seen during the morning hours by shopkeepers and passers-by who recognized him. Those who recalled the sightings described him as alone, calm, and unharmed. Nothing in their accounts suggested distress or interference. The errands themselves were ordinary, the kind expected of a child in a working household. William left the house on foot, dressed for the cold, and was last observed moving along Hampstead Road in the direction of the shops. By early afternoon, Agnes expected him home. As the hours passed and daylight began to fade, William did not return. At first, Agnes Starchfield did not panic. Delays were common in winter, especially with snow slowing movement and daylight fading earlier than usual. She waited, expecting William to appear at the door at any moment, penny spent and errand completed. When he did not, she stepped outside and looked along Hampstead Road, scanning the pavements and side streets he would normally use. As the afternoon passed, concern replaced patience. Agnes walked the nearby routes herself, checking shop fronts and asking those she encountered if they had seen her son. No one could say where he had gone after the morning sightings. With darkness beginning to settle over North London, the search widened beyond the immediate streets. Later that day, Agnes notified the police. At that stage, there was no indication of violence or foul play. Children were known to wander, to seek shelter from cold in stairwells or shops, or to miss their way in unfamiliar weather. Officers treated the report as a disappearance rather than a crime, assuming William might still be found nearby. As evening approached, the absence took on greater weight. The cold deepened, visibility dropped, and ordinary explanations began to thin. At 4:14 in the afternoon, a North London railway train departed from Chalk Farm, beginning its routine journey toward Broad Street. The line passed through a sequence of familiar stations, carrying office workers, labourers, and bundled passengers escaping the cold. Nothing about the departure distinguished it from countless others that day. As the train approached Shoreditch later that afternoon, it slowed as expected. At the platform, a newspaper messenger named Robert Stillwell boarded one of the carriages to collect unsold papers left behind by vendors earlier in the day. His task was routine, carried out daily, and required him to move quickly through the third-class compartments. While checking beneath the seats, Stillwell noticed something out of place. Protruding from under one of the benches was a small hand. At first glance, it appeared motionless and unnaturally pale. He stopped and looked more closely, realizing that the hand belonged to a child concealed beneath the seat. Stillwell immediately left the carriage and alerted railway staff. The train was prevented from continuing its journey, and station officials were summoned. Within minutes, what had been an ordinary commuter service was treated as a controlled scene, and word was sent for the police to attend. Once the discovery was reported, the train was halted and the affected carriage cleared. Railway staff secured the compartment while waiting for police officers to arrive. Passengers were directed away, and the service was delayed as the situation was assessed. What had begun as a routine stop quickly became a controlled investigation. When the police reached the carriage, they confirmed that the child beneath the third-class seat was deceased. The body was carefully removed from the train and transported to Old Street Police Station for formal examination. At the time of discovery, the child's identity was unknown. No documents or personal items were found that could immediately explain who he was or how he had come to be there. Officers noted only the injuries that were plainly visible and later recorded in official reports. There was bruising to the face, and marks were observed around the neck. These details were documented without speculation as to cause or responsibility. No public statements were made beyond the basic facts, and the scene was handled as a matter of procedure rather than display. With the body secured and the carriage released, attention turned to a single unresolved task. Somewhere in North London, a child had gone missing. The priority now was to determine who he was and where he had come from. As word of the discovery spread through police channels, officers began comparing reports of missing children received earlier that day. Agnes Starchfield was contacted and asked to come to Old Street Police Station. By the time she arrived, the examination of the body was already underway. Agnes identified the child as her son, William. The identification was made without hesitation and was recorded formally by attending officers. With that confirmation, the disappearance reported earlier that afternoon was no longer treated as a routine missing child case. Medical examination provided further clarity. Based on condition and timing, officials determined that William had been deceased for no more than 2 hours before he was found on the train. The cause of death was later recorded as strangulation, consistent with the marks observed on his neck. With William Starchfield identified and the circumstances of his death confirmed, the matter shifted immediately from search to investigation. What had begun as concern over a delayed errand was now treated as a homicide, requiring a full and structured inquiry. With William identified and the cause of death established, police turned to immediate family members to establish the child's movements and circumstances. William's father, John Starchfield, was located later that day at a mission near Tottenham Court Road, where he was known to sell newspapers. Officers brought him in for questioning at Bow Street Police Station. Records showed that John and Agnes Starchfield were living apart at the time of William's death. The separation was noted in police documentation, but no conclusions were drawn from it. John cooperated with officers and provided an account of his whereabouts during the day, which was recorded for review. At this stage, John Starchfield was not charged. He was questioned as a matter of procedure, in keeping with standard practice in cases involving the death of a child. No public accusation was made, and no formal allegation was laid against him. With statements taken and family circumstances established, investigators moved on to a broader task. They began reconstructing William's day in detail, tracing his movements from the moment he left Hampstead Road that morning. As investigators worked to reconstruct William Starchfield's final hours, they began collecting statements from members of the public who believed they had seen the boy during the afternoon of 8th of January. These accounts formed a loose sequence rather than a single continuous path, and each was treated with caution. Several witnesses reported seeing a child matching William's description travelling on a bus later that day. Others placed him at a tube station, where he was observed moving calmly through the entrance area. One of the most closely examined sightings came from individuals who claimed to have seen William walking hand in hand with an adult male. The man was not identified, and no interaction suggesting distress was reported. To assess, set memory and encourage further leads, police circulated a photograph of William to witnesses and to the wider public. His image was distributed through newspapers and posted notices, a common practice at the time. While this led to additional statements, it also introduced uncertainty, as later witnesses were recalling events after seeing the photograph rather than before. The volume of reports increased rapidly. Newspapers carried the story across London, and public interest intensified as fragments of William's last movements appeared to emerge, still incomplete and unconfirmed as a whole. Alongside witness statements, police examined physical evidence connected to the case. Near Tufnell Park, officers recovered a length of string tied into a loop, with strands of hair caught in it. The item was documented and retained, though no immediate conclusion could be drawn about its origin or use. It was not conclusively linked to any individual, and no witness could identify it as belonging to a specific person. Medical examination of William's body provided additional information. His stomach contents were analysed, revealing partially digested currants. This finding aligned with statements from the baker, supporting the account that William had completed his errand there earlier in the day. Beyond confirming the timeline of his morning movements, the evidence offered no further direction. Taken together, the physical findings clarified certain details while leaving larger questions unanswered. They confirmed that William had followed the expected route at least part of the day, but they did not establish how he came to be on the train or who was responsible for his death. With the initial investigation complete, the case moved into its next formal stage. An inquest was scheduled to examine the circumstances of William Starchfield's death. The inquest into the death of William Starchfield opened on the 13th of January 1914, less than a week after his body was discovered. Proceedings were held to establish the facts of the case, rather than to assign guilt, following the legal practice of the time. Testimony was taken from medical professionals, police officers, and selected witnesses who had provided statements during the investigation. Medical evidence was presented first. The examining doctor confirmed that William's death had been caused by strangulation, consistent with the marks observed on his neck and the absence of other fatal injuries. Based on the condition of the body, the estimated time of death aligned with the late afternoon of 8th of January. Investigators summarized the witness accounts collected in the days following the discovery. These included reported sightings on public transport and observations made after William's photograph had been circulated. The physical evidence recovered near Tufnell Park was also referenced, though no definitive connection was established. After reviewing the testimony, the jury returned a verdict of willful murder. With that finding entered into the record, the legal status of the case changed. Responsibility now had to be formally assigned, and John Starchfield was charged in connection with his son's death. The trial of John Starchfield opened on the 31st of March 1914. What had appeared at the inquest stage to be a coherent chain of events was now tested under cross-examination. From the outset, the prosecution's case relied heavily on witness testimony rather than direct physical proof. Defense counsel focused first on the reliability of identification. Several witnesses who had placed William on buses, at stations, or walking with an adult acknowledged that they had been shown a photograph of the child before giving formal statements. This raised questions about whether their recollections were independent or influenced by repeated exposure to William's image in newspapers and police notices. Further doubt was introduced when it emerged that a reward had been offered in connection with the case. The defense argued that financial incentive could not be separated from memory, particularly in a case that had drawn intense public attention. Witnesses were questioned closely about when they came forward and what they had seen before and after the photograph was circulated. Alibi testimony was then presented on John Starchfield's behalf. Individuals connected to his routine at Tottenham Court Road provided accounts of his movements on the afternoon of 8th of January. These statements were supported by evidence from railway employees, including a signalman and train staff, whose records and observations complicated the prosecution's timeline. As contradictions accumulated, the clarity suggested by earlier proceedings began to fracture. By the close of testimony, the court was left with uncertainty rather than resolution, prompting direct intervention from the judge. With the evidence fully heard, the presiding judge addressed the jury directly. He instructed them on the limits of the case as it stood, emphasizing the absence of proof that could place John Starchfield with his son at the time of death. The weaknesses exposed during cross-examination, particularly concerning witness identification and timing, could not be set aside. Following these directions, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. John Starchfield was discharged, and the charge against him was formally dismissed. No appeal followed, and no further proceedings were initiated against him. The court did not identify an alternative suspect. With the acquittal entered into the record, the legal process reached its conclusion. In the eyes of the law, the case was closed, even as the circumstances surrounding William Starchfield's death remained unresolved. William Starchfield was buried a few days after the trial concluded. His funeral drew an unusually large crowd, with newspaper reports estimating that several thousand people attended. The scale of the gathering reflected the public attention the case had received and the sympathy it had generated across London. In the months that followed, Agnes Starchfield struggled visibly. Court records show that in June 1914, she appeared before magistrates after an incident attributed to emotional distress. She was fined and bound over to keep the peace. No further legal action was taken against her, but contemporary accounts noted a marked decline in her mental health following her son's death and the collapse of the case. John Starchfield continued to maintain his innocence. After his acquittal, he returned to relative obscurity and did not re-enter public discussion of the case. There is no record of further police interest in him after the trial. In 1916, John Starchfield died from complications related to a gunshot wound he had sustained years earlier. His death passed with little notice, and with it, direct testimony from the central figures in the case began to fade. Several years after the death of William Starchfield, the case briefly resurfaced under unexpected circumstances. A man named John Fitzpatrick came forward and claimed responsibility for the child's death. His statement attracted limited attention at the time, largely because it emerged long after the investigation and trial had concluded. Authorities reviewed the claim but found no supporting evidence. Fitzpatrick was known to suffer from mental instability, and his account could not be corroborated by witnesses, physical evidence, or records from the original inquiry. No details he provided aligned in a verifiable way with the established timeline or circumstances of the case. As a result, the confession was dismissed as unreliable, no charges were brought, and the matter was not reopened. The statement was noted in later summaries of the case, but carried no legal weight. With no new evidence and no viable suspect, the confession marked the final documented attempt to explain what had happened. After that, the official record fell silent. With the trial concluded and no further action taken, the death of William Starchfield passed from active investigation into record. The case survived not through resolution, but through documentation. Newspaper reports, inquest transcripts, and court proceedings preserved the known facts while leaving the central question unanswered. No conviction was ever secured. No alternative suspect was formally identified or charged. Beyond the brief reappearance prompted by Fitzpatrick's dismissed confession, the case was never reopened. What remained was a fixed sequence of dates, testimonies, and decisions, unchanged by later interpretation or discovery. Over time, public memory faded. The crowds that once gathered, the headlines that spread across London, and the scrutiny of the courtroom all receded. William Starchfield's name endured only where it had been recorded. On paper, in archives, and in the margins of early 20th century criminal history. The documents confirm what can be proven and leave the rest untouched. The legal process reached its end. The file closed. The question did not.